Welcome everybody to our third webinar in the series, and we're coming to you today from University of Canberra, and I have with me one of the project partners, my colleague Jennifer Munday from Charles Sturt University in Albury, and we have a few participants here at University of Canberra sitting with us for the live webinar. And then we're going to have a discussion with them afterwards. So thank you very much for joining us. As it says on the front screen there, that this portfolio series is an OLT funded project, and University of Canberra is one of our partners, so we thank them very much today for hosting us. And I think we've got people from Charles Sturt, UNSW, Sydney Uni and University of Canberra, and a much broader audience today as well, as we invited some people from the PebblePad user group. The background for today is that we're looking at particularly exploring assessment and evidence based on some work that I think Shane Nusler here at University of Canberra has been involved in getting some feedback from his academics, and this was one of the topic areas that they felt was worthy of discussion, and certainly my experience at Sydney Uni, it's a hot topic. Jenny, I imagine at Charles Sturt.
Always. And I think it's one of the questions that we get asked most, isn't it, about ePortfolios? It's where it comes back to assessment. How do you assess them?
Yeah, okay. So let's get moving then. And hopefully we've now got a few more participants in the room, which means that I've done my job of the first 4 minutes, letting everyone get logged on and settled in. So today we're actually going to look at assessment and evidence in ePortfolio processes and products. The key points that Jenny and I sort of looked at were really ones that Shane from University of Canberra had given us. We just added a little bit to them. Welcome, hello. And so you can see on the screen there that we're going to spend a little bit of time talking again about the technology perhaps being a barrier to some students' engagement with portfolio work, and the question about how we reverse that. We're going to look specifically at what I suppose Jenny and I define as evidence,
yep.
And in our practice, what we've actually worked with as far as the accrediting bodies needing to do that. If you're not joined any of our webinars before, I'll just explain that I'm at Sydney University in the music faculty, Conservatorium of Music, and I work specifically in teacher education, teacher training. So I'm training musicians to become music teachers in New South Wales high schools. And, well, Jenny, you can tell people what you do.
Well, I work in the Faculty of Education at Charles Sturt University, and we're training teachers, but the ePortfolios are used across discipline in some of the other faculties as well. So.
Yeah, so we do have fairly good idea about professional standards and meeting accreditation standards, and in fact it was the impetus in 2009 for me to start working with electronic portfolios, because I needed to find a solution to how I would actually gather enough evidence through my assessment tasks to prove that the students had met the graduate professional teacher standards. I know that many of the health sciences particularly are engaged in trying to meet accreditation standards as well, and I'm sure that's just going to spread rapidly across all of the disciplines. The third point that we're going to look at today is really, and I liked this one, Shada, how to describe what I'm looking for to students without exemplars, because it's a really constant question that I get. You know, can you just show me one so that I know what I'm doing? And as we continually explain the difference between the ePortfolio process and the ePortfolio product, we're trying to, and especially in my work with quite creative students, I'm trying to explain to them that it's about their own personal learning journey. It's about them trying to engage in the teaching and learning, the pedagogy of portfolio development, and how they can creatively sort of engage in that, but particularly how they can start also, you know, thinking about their thinking and critical thinking skills that are really required for that. So just because we felt really sorry for that question, we have got some exemplars to show you today. But remember, they're our experiences. Yes. We should not state any conflict of interest, but state our similarity is that Jenny and I both work with PebblePad because that's what's in our institution. I know at UC you've got Mahara, and there's quite a few other places that are working Mahara, WordPress, or various other ones. The fourth one is how much evidence is needed to make a judgment for assessment purposes. Now I'm hoping that is a hot topic of everyone raising their hand and asking questions about that one, because I'm not sure I know the answer, and I'm actually quite pleased I don't know the answer to that one, because I think it's really discipline specific, assessment task specific, unit of study, you know, how many credit points is each worth, how much is the assessment task worth as a percentage of the unit of study that they're carrying. You know, is the ePortfolio across the program, or is it just in discrete units of study? You know, I think that really needs to be thought about. What feedback methods are commonly used to communicate about assessment? I'm having a wry smile here because someone's just emailed me saying, could I give them the link for today's webinar? Do I stop and answer that email? No, I don't think I will. Anyway, and feedback methods are commonly used to communicate about assessment. Jenny and I had a long conversation, and we worked out that we agreed that, you know, good pedagogic practice is always to provide a rubric. So we've got a little bit of information about what we contain in those rubrics specific to portfolio work that we do. And finally, how can I manage to mark ePortfolio products in a small amount of time that I have for each student? Thanks for putting that one in, Shane. That was really good. But if that's the common feedback that you're getting from people, I don't have an answer to that one. I feel like I'm pretty much work 7 days a week, and, you know, in a virtual world, my students are expecting answers quite often at, you know, 9 o'clock Saturday night. Why they're not out partying like most adolescents should be, I don't know. But if they're doing their assignments, yeah, that's right. They're doing their assignments before they go out, obviously. But yeah, it's something that, you know, you do have to think about, and I think it's in the design of the assessment task.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's what you have to really manage. So if everyone's happy with those things, and again, I thank Shane for getting the feedback from your community here. So learning the technology. Gee, where do I start with that one? Because I've just been on the phone to my technology person at Sydney Uni for the last half an hour just to set up Adobe Connect, and this is the third webinar I've run, so I'm not really sure that I'm the right person to be answering this. I'll tell you what I do though, and I think Jenny and I probably had very similar experiences with this. I certainly work face-to-face with my students. I do an information session where I talk specifically about PebblePad. I give them some examples. I let them have a, you know, very much a hands-on approach. I make sure that this workshop or this seminar is very early on. Now, bearing in mind that very early on in any course, they're thinking about their readings and how they're going to manage their assessment tasks and where it fits into, you know, their world. So perhaps they're not focusing completely on doing their, you know, this particular assessment task. But I do think that that's, you know, a really important step, that there is a face-to-face component in working with the platform that you've got.
Or if not, if in distance mode like some of our students are, then, you know, either an online meeting like this or clear step-by-step videos that they can stop and start and continue it.
So face-to-face in the virtual world.
That's right.
Yeah, adapting it for that way. And, you know, as we searched even University of Canberra's website yesterday, we saw that there's some excellent online help with screenshots that have been created by the institution, or maybe even the subject coordinator, and that seemed like a really good way that augments what is already online by the software provider.
Yes, but also, I mean, that face-to-face component is really important, and even if it is an online meeting, In the fact that Jennifer's recording what we're doing today, that sort of thing is quite possible. So long as you have some students with you in the online classroom space, then you can give them that face-to-face tuition.
I think it's also really important that you specifically look to tailoring the assessment task requirements to the actual technology that you're using. So I suppose I've never thought about it this way, but I use very Pebble-centric language when I speak to my students about the portfolio product, quite differently when I'm talking about the ePortfolio processes, because to me that's about the learning and teaching, the pedagogic approach, all those things I talked about before, the reflection, the critical thinking, the metacognition. You know, that's a really key part. But I think it's really important that you don't try and overwhelm them and have an expectation that they'll be technology experts at the end of this. My focus is always on the benefit of the student engagement in doing this work. So I don't know that I go overboard. I did go overboard for a few years. I had some money, and that's why I've put the double dollar signs there, through an OLT grant prior to this extension grant that actually allowed me to have one-on-one tuition with my students. So they basically booked an hour as many times as they liked with a person who sat with them and actually went through Pebble and helped them create their portfolios specific to the assessment task.
And we did put those dollar signs there because if this is the process that we go to, it does end up being that the occasional student will need that one-on-one. You know, so they're usually a small handful of students in each group that will need to sit next to you or an educational designer and just have, and it is expensive, but that's what we're here for.
That's right. I suppose
I find tailoring the help resources to the assessment task quite useful as well. Yeah. So, for example, Shane and I have done numerous videos on Mahara here at UC, and actually targeting in the first unit that I run, that often their first encountering with Mahara, a lot of the help videos are specifically how they do components of that first portfolio task. And that helps amazingly with their confidence.
Yes, I would definitely nod in agreement with that one. I introduced Portfolio into our internship program, and I actually, inside Pebble, you can create tailor-made templates. And so I actually made templates that had key questions and key components and little help things inside that, so that they were able to actually be guided, I suppose, through the assessment task, which was good. I'm not sure that answered everybody's questions, but there's no hands up and there's no chat going on, so I think we'll just go to the next one, which is...
Could you talk briefly about user interface design and, you know, bringing the barriers down as well as helping them be overcome?
When you say, how do we bring the barriers down?
Yeah. So how do you make user interfaces better? How do you identify where the weak points are and overcome them over time?
Well, I think that's, for me, in Pebble, that's having continual dialogue, I suppose, with the people that are providing the interface that we're working with. I find them incredibly easy to speak with. They've got Australian consultants, even though they're a UK company, and I find they do explain and respond quite specifically. The difficulty is that they're trying to, well, not trying to, they have to take on board the feedback, but they've got to have a product that's also available to a range of people.
Also, because in the courses that we're interested in discussing at the moment between ourselves, the ePortfolio is embedded, and it sounds like you have one as well here at CU. Yes, sorry. And I think that's the other side of it, not letting the students have too long away from it, so that if you have it embedded in your degree, then the more they use it, the easier it becomes. So the difficulties we've encountered are when students use it once and then, you know, get to fourth year and someone says, oh, hand in your ePortfolio, and they go, what ePortfolio? So it's that sense of making sure that it's a useful thing for them to do more often.
And that they understand right from that very first encountering of the ePortfolio software that this is something that will grow with time.
Absolutely.
I think also it's important to take a very you know, standard pedagogic approach to their learning, and saying you've got to apply a sequence and a scope to where they're really going. You know, so you don't want to have the most difficult thing for them to do in week 6, semester 1, year 1. You know, you want to actually make sure that it builds.
Now, I just have to read this comment, so please don't stop making comments or asking questions, but they can't hear you.
Oh, my apologies.
So you have to speak up when you are asking Jennifer a question.
Okay. All right. We'll just move on to evidence and what do accrediting bodies accept as evidence. I really strongly feel that the evidence has to be designed. What you ask for in your assessment task and what you ask for evidence has to be to show the student's learning journey over time. I think you've got to plan it really carefully so that they're not sort of Mickey Mouse sorts of assessment tasks. You know, so students will say to me, I want to stick this in my portfolio. And I go, well, okay, out of those 15 Stedford certificates that you've got, what do you think that shows? What would be something that would actually demonstrate that you've achieved a knowledge of the discipline? You know, well, I don't really want to see your 15 certificates, but what do you think might be something that would, you know, actually show me that you've learnt and mastered that? So I kind of give it back to them and I say it's really important for you to choose your evidence wisely. Sure, if you want to put in, you know, your certificates, that's okay. But you've got to remember that the person that's assessing or looking for that evidence needs to be able to find it quickly and for it to actually do its job, which is to give evidence that you've met that standard. So I do actually not say to them, don't put things in. I more or less say to them, think carefully about what you want to put in because it has to have some meaning. I think because the evidence actually records and tracks discipline-specific, or not, development through reflection on and in their practice, they need to be really careful to select something that does show that they've got a mastery in and on their practice. So possible artefacts for me, and I think Jenny's in a very similar situation, are things like lesson plans or supervising teachers' evaluation or their own evaluation of those, any correspondence that might be between themselves and the lecturer. There might be some discussion board work that goes on as well between them as a group. Any achievements that they may have. I think the rubrics, definitely. We've just started our second years creating their own rubrics, and we're finding that really, really good because as we ask, like we model how to create a rubric and then we say you create one, and that's actually an assessment task. So then can actually upload that to their portfolio, and that gives evidence that they're able to actually understand what assessment is about. There's, I think, projects that you work on.
Yes, I think that also it's worth saying that I guess over the period of a student's undergraduate degree, for instance, there's a certain amount of scaffolding how to talk about their evidence and their artefacts, and I think that's what you were referring to, Jennifer, with you know, not just putting in all of those documents, but being able to say why they're important and explain how they're showing evidence of your achievement. So when we put in achievements or projects, I mean, you can just plonk them there, but unless there's some context around them, so helping students to explain the inclusions in an ePortfolio is very important.
And I think that's where things like audio and video files come in really handy, because sometimes an actual real piece of evidence, an authentic piece of evidence, so a student with an audio file that might be them explaining a concept to another student, you know, that's a very strong piece of evidence that, you know, shows that they've been able to demonstrate that particular skill. Look, I put badges in inverted commas because I know it's the new trendy word, or maybe it's the old trendy word, but anything that shows their achievement, then I think that's, you know, well,
badges tend to be skill-based around small modules of learning that can now be incorporated into ePortfolios. So, you know, your institution might have a badge around reflective practice, for instance. So going through a number of learning outcomes might allow a student to
be
have,
awarded that
yes.
badge. Yeah. As I said, it is a new word maybe in some of our institutions. It's certainly an old word in the literature. It's been around for 3 or 4 years, I suppose, hasn't it?
And then there's also brownies and cubs.
Well, I was just going to say I do scouts. That's where I know
Yes,
about
that's
badges
right.
from.
I think that's where it's come from. You know, you
Yeah,
get a badge
yeah.
for a particular
First aid
skill.
badge.
Oh, yes,
Absolutely.
and we can give them a backpack and they sew their badges on there. They're all virtual things, though.
That's why they go in the ePortfolio.
Which is just sew on when they're virtual.
That's right. And finally, of course, graduate attributes, you know, whatever's generic attributes, graduate capabilities, whatever's specific to your institution.
So Jennifer, one of the things that came up here in the occupational therapy course was the accrediting body worrying that some of the evidence being collected could be tied back to a patient or a person.
So confidentiality.
Confidentiality, but they were quite extreme in how much evidence they wanted to strip out of what was being provided. So when does it stop being evidence?
I think that probably gets back to Jenny's point about how much you put in there has to also be explained. It has to have meaning. And so I think that instead of perhaps videoing a real patient having, you know, a cannula
Yes, that's your example.
inserted into them, you know, maybe it's actually some kind of written piece about describing the process without actually having, you know, breached that confidentiality.
Could the nature of the operation at a certain hospital be enough to tie the evidence back to somebody?
I'm kind of
The
thinking
ethics
now
questions.
copyright, you know, and how many things I can place on Blackboard, you know, and should I have them going towards the library instead of, you know, articles that I'd like them to read. You know, I think it is a great area in portfolio work.
And it's a negotiation really between the accrediting body and the discipline and the students.
And maybe the accrediting body needs to get a little bit better at asking what they actually want in evidence and being more specific. Because we can only create good assessment tasks that shows a demonstration of achieving that graduate skill or that potential professional standard if we get very, very clear, you know, situational context.
The profession wants to know that the graduate is competent in the profession and yet may not want the kind of evidence being collected that would enable you to make that judgment.
Yeah.
I think there are a number of disciplines that have similar sorts of things, maybe not as far left as that, but I mean teachers, for instance, you know, we don't want to be taking pictures of children and permission and things
That's
like
right.
that. So I think Jennifer's right. It is about clearly describing and using what you can ethically and legally use, keeping in mind that, you know, ePortfolios have different purposes and different audiences. So an ePortfolio for assessment within an institution may be all right to have lots of photographs of children because they're not going beyond that firewall. But of course, if you're then sending that ePortfolio out as a showcase to a prospective employer, well then, you know, all ethical considerations must be taken by the student or the prospective.
And I don't think that's a bad explanation and lesson for the student to learn. You know, if they're going into a profession, they need to understand those, you know, boundaries, don't they, of confidentiality and, you know, patient anonymity and those sorts of things. I mean, I certainly say to my students, you know, you're doing a subject that might be clearly asking you to show the skills of conducting an ensemble in a school.
Yeah.
You know, we're looking at you conducting, we're not looking at the students responding to your conducting. So don't have any student faces in that if you're going to do a video of it. You know, we want a video of you. That's very different.
And my position is that all the evidence students collect treat as public, because one day they might take that information out of your system and stick it into another system that has open access, for example, because what they collect is theirs technically, I guess.
That's an interesting point from I don't know anything about Mahara, but you know, perhaps that's a possibility. I know that in the Pebble accounts, students have absolute control over that. I can't look into a student's account. They have to share everything they want with me.
It's the same with Mahara.
Okay. I think clearly the evidence has to demonstrate that they've actually synthesised and evaluated the learning somewhere, and that's why I go back to, you know, maybe certificates are not such a good idea, but a badge would be a good idea, because the badge means that you actually have to go through a series of steps to earn that and demonstrate the learning outcomes through there. And, you know, any kind of evidence should show competence. Don't put evidence in if you're not actually competent at that skill or you haven't met the learning outcome. So be clever in that way.
I wasn't sure whether this was a slide, Jennifer, where we were going to talk about the fact that ePortfolios are very good places to collect evidence, though, for accrediting bodies.
I think it is. I think it's, and as I said, that's how we started our whole ePortfolio journey. We had a list of the 47 or 49 graduate standards that had to be met as teachers, and they had to provide a piece of evidence and write about each one of those.
What were those two words you used before? Synthesize and
Evaluation.
evaluate.
Yeah, they have to be able to evaluate. They have to be able to synthesize what they've learned, and they've got to be able to evaluate and give an opinion on it and put in their own words.
Taken it in, mould it over, spat it out.
Yeah, that's right. You know, they should be able to clearly understand what they've learned and articulate that.
So Sandra's just made the point that that with Pebble they can put things with a URL which makes them public. And I think that we just need to go back to your point, Jennifer, that the students need to clearly understand the difference between, you know, something that's shared internally within an institution for assessment, for an assessment task, and then what goes out beyond the walls and gets shared beyond the university.
Yeah, and I suppose if they want to think about it like Facebook, you know, which is apparently now quite clearly a component of a job selection for a candidate, that employers will actually look at candidates' Facebook pages to see whether or not, you know, there's perhaps behaviours or photos or unsuitability that they see there. Now, employers have said that that is not an unusual activity once they've interviewed a candidate to go and view their Facebook. So I think, you know, they've got to start thinking about the portfolio as not right now when they're doing it in their institution, it's private. But they've got to have the training to understand that's a skill as well, that it can be public.
I've also heard employers comment that if a student, if they look up a prospective employee on Facebook and they don't find anything, that can also be a red flag, because it says that student, you know, that person isn't technologically comfortable, they're not digitally active, all of those kinds of things. So say, for example, a graduate going for a position in social media marketing, if they don't have a public-facing Facebook profile, then that's an indication that they may not have those skills.
Yeah.
So it can count against them in other ways other than just drunken photographs from the weekend.
Rosemary still would like you to speak up a little bit.
My apologies, Rosemary.
I'm sorry, I've got the audio as loud as I can.
I have one scenario from Steve Isbell, an OT, who can't be here. Is it okay if I read out what he's got?
Nice and loudly.
So in OT, they currently get students to populate a collection that they copy from a template. So the collection comes from a template. They relate the situation, that is a clinical experience, as an assignment to their graduate competencies in OT. So they take a template and populate this template, which is based on the competencies. They must provide evidence that they meet the competency, which is operationalized. They have a pass-fail marking system, and basically the student, if the student provides a reasonable item of evidence, they pass. They do this in a one-to-one presentation with an academic. So any suggestions on how to improve this would be appreciated.
Do I understand that by saying how it's not a presentation one-to-one to an academic? Is that?
It is a presentation.
Yeah, I know, but
so
she'd like it not to be that?
How do they want
Steve's just wondering how that might be improved.
Okay.
It might already be fine.
Sounds pretty good to me, and
Yeah,
I think
thought
that
so too.
that the one-to-one feedback to the student, if that could be recorded, and maybe the student could even edit it to be even further evidence in their ePortfolio for, you know, to show development.
Okay.
So my only thought about improving that would be to try and capture it digitally somehow, and whether that might be even just recording and then editing a component of that face-to-face presentation. That,
Same. Yeah.
you know, that, I know, but I'm just saying that that's probably,
Yeah.
you know, unless you want to change the face-to-face presentation, you know.
Okay.
But if that is the instance, you know, the student themselves, maybe that's what you're saying, Jennifer, that the student might record themselves actually leading a viewer through their ePortfolio. So that could be an audio component of the ePortfolio.
Or they could just go the simple, you know, TED Talk. They could actually put that forward as their presentation. I mean, you know, at times I've said to my students, I wish I didn't have to go to conferences overseas. I wish I could just record myself, send a video over.
Well, now you can.
You know, and I think, well, why can't you do that? You know, I mean, you miss the interaction.
TED Talk as in just a straight video of yourself talking.
Yeah,
Because they
yeah.
have slides.
So there's slides, you know, so it, you know, like TED
So
Talks
like
usually have an audience.
Like a recorded lecture.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
I guess my question might be, is this specifically an ePortfolio task? I mean, it sounds to me like it would be a fantastic section of an ePortfolio that a student could use and build on, you know, over time. So I would see it as a good page in a webfolio.
Right.
But I'm not sure whether that one thing is in the right place then, if that's the type of presentation that they have to do for that assessment task.
Mm.
And I think that's
really
always a good question, you know, like, are we assessing the correct way? You know, could the portfolio actually replace some of those more traditional? I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but
Well, yes, I mean, could this just be a PowerPoint slide that a student talks to with the evidence embedded, or is it a really good thing to collect in the ePortfolio because it means that they can, you know, in 1 or 2 years, reflect on that and say, well, I've come this far further
that's right.
now.
I again use the slide about the ePortfolio and the end users, and you know, just for you to always think about, you know, when you're collecting your evidence and when you're thinking about creating your assessment tasks towards evidence and demonstration of a specific skill in, you know, particularly in a discrete unit of study, you have to think about who you're doing it for. You're doing it for me to get a mark? Are you doing it for you to get employed? Are you doing it, you know, for your peers to share the work that you're doing? Is it, you know, I think you really need to think specifically.
So you might need to answer a specific question, Jennifer. So Thomas says, I'm Steve's colleague and happy to answer any questions on this. We're wondering if this is good enough. So we're not quite sure what you mean, Thomas, by good enough.
I think it's that evaluation process. Are they doing enough to?
I think one-on-one is
judge.
fantastic. I mean, that's the very best any student could ask for, really, isn't it?
I think so, yeah. And without knowing the content of your, like actually seeing your specific learning outcomes and not looking at your curriculum map about what you're assessing, it, you know, like how many other assessment tasks there are and how it's done, it's really difficult to sort of answer that.
I think predominantly it's the portfolio.
Okay.
So Thomas and Shane, we'd be happy to talk more about that, or have, you know, maybe when we get up to some examples, we can talk more about just what we know. We're only talking from our own experiences, really,
Yes,
aren't we?
yeah. So describing what you're looking to students without exemplars, look, I think search for them. They're easy to find on Google, and I think you modify them. And I think if you don't have any at the moment, then perhaps take that as a first step in that way. Obviously, like anything that you run for the first time, hopefully you're evaluating how you created the assessment task? Did it meet the learning outcomes? Is it specifically meeting the target, which is to collect evidence? You know, I think you need to ask yourself that question as well. So perhaps you even create an exemplar in that process of evaluation. I think it's really important that, well, I model in my own teaching, you know, what I have as expectations of evidence. So I quite often will show students of my own, you know, my own evidence of how I got to a certain point. So I might show them an article that I read. I might talk specifically about, you know, how I drew out of that some key questions to ask myself, you know, whether or not these would actually demonstrate learning. You know, and then I created key questions or an activity for them to do in a seminar. You know, so I'm sort of trying to explain my processes as I go along, and that almost creates an exemplar as well for them. I think leave the student to be really creative is important.
We talked about that because, and Shane has talked about templates. You know, we quite often use templates, and they're really good, particularly in the beginning, to help students structure their work. Students would like templates all the time, and there are times when we just turn around and say, well, no, now this time you know what you've got to put in there, you do your own thing. That's why we put resistance is futile, because sometimes students just have to be creative.
Yeah, and I think, you know, Sandra's made a good point there. You know, you could actually create a dummy exemplar as you go through the process yourself. And I suppose that was what I was trying to say, Sandra, you know, like as you go through and think about how you've created your assessment task, you could actually be creating the assessment task and using it as an exemplar. I mean, I quite often will actually write the answer to an essay topic that I've given my students. I will actually sit down and write the answer, and I'll think, oh, okay, now I've got a really good idea about what I'm looking for with the students. I've just taught them for, you know, 8 or 9 weeks. They've got this essay topic. I've read what they've read. I know what they're doing. I've written my essay. And then I might take components out of that essay and I say, here's a good introduction. Here's an interesting part, you know, of how you might describe, you know, the biological changes in adolescent development, you know, in a developmental psych course that I'm teaching. So I will actually do the task, and then that gives me an exemplar as well. I'm hoping that my exemplar is not bad.
I'm sure it's wonderful.
That's right.
It's got to get a high distinction.
Thank you, yes, especially when I'm marking it. And I think it's really important that you have a really good, thorough, you know, excellent learning and teaching design. You know, so be aware of how you design your program or the unit of study that you're doing. You know, be really clear that your learning objectives are meeting what you want to actually meet, and the assessment tasks are certainly meeting the learning objectives. So I'll go back to my old, you know, stone that I keep grinding, which is that if you don't have your curriculum well designed and well mapped, then you're going to have a real struggle for students to do assessment tasks that can provide evidence for the learning outcomes being managed. Gee, I got over that one quickly, didn't I, Shane?
We can come back to it maybe.
Couple of questions.
Be nice and loud.
Sorry, you're talking about students collecting evidence over a period of their whole degree potentially?
For me, yes, because I've got it embedded into the 4-year degree program, undergraduate.
So my thought would be that's great for the ones who are pretty good to start with, but there are students in my course and their first efforts are dire. So would you recommend that they edit those out later on, or?
I think that they've got a very good case for development, for showing development. I mean, it actually brings up a point that I thought about before, and, you know, what is the whole ePortfolio? I think from my point of view, we should be asking students to collect evidence of a variety of things in whatever their ePortfolio space is. And then they arrange or publish their work for a different purpose, which is this next slide that Jennifer's got. And so, you know, they may not need to show development in everything. But when it comes to a fourth year and they need to, you know, they've been doing differently and maybe a little better every year, but when it comes to the final year, how magnificent to be able to go back and show that, oh gee, I wasn't going very well at the beginning. Here is a bit of evidence that shows that I was still getting used to my university thinking, and look how far I've come when you see the kind of comments that academics are making about my work now. So I think that, I don't think there's ever anything that's not valuable that's in there, but it's how the student presents it and for what purpose. So this is one of my favourite things that perhaps I harp on about, and that's the purpose of the ePortfolio. And these 4 purposes were stated by Stefani, Pegler and Mason way back in, I think, 2007. And I find them very helpful to explain what an ePortfolio might be at each year level in the course that we're running. So in the first year, it might be reflection, because it's reflection bringing them into the university space, and it will be about assessment. You know, the next year might be a combination of 2 other purposes. So each year level, it's a combination of different purposes, but not always the same. And it goes back to Jennifer talking about, you know, designing different kind of learning experiences that will allow students to demonstrate that they've been able to produce ePortfolios for different purposes. The showcase being the one, I mean, that could happen at different times during a degree, but definitely at the end. And it's not going to have everything in it. It's going to be carefully chosen items by the student to show what they can do in their prospective profession.
I might just add one comment to, you know, first year's portfolio work being dire. I'd change my assessment task. If it's really coming out as a dire response, I'd be saying...
not for most, you know, it's just that some students are.
Right, yeah.
University is a shock sometimes.
Yes, and I did notice there's a
okay.
shakedown process over the first year, even the first semester. But
Because I did change my first year ePortfolio task this year, and I think I took it probably more to a reflective task. It was due in week 6. They were asked to do a reading each week, and I asked them to choose 3 of those 6 readings that they've done and to actually write a reflection of 400 words only. So I made the task very, very small, quite, you know, not extensive in that, you know,
achievable.
It was achievable. It was bounded by those 6 readings. And, you know, all of them said, but what if I've read something else? What if I've watched a TED talk? What if I've done that? And I said, well, that's terrific. You may, of course, add that component to it, as long as I see evidence that you've read those 3 readings, made the connections between them, evaluated them, and been able to write me a reflection that actually talked to me about the key ideas in music education according to these first 6 weeks. Now, the products were fabulous. I don't think I had one dire one, because I made it very, very small. Whereas before I'd said to them, oh well, you know, anything that you've thought about as a key idea in music education, anything that you'd actually done, seen, thought, you know, include that. So I made it very, very tight.
Priscilla is asking, she says, great task, Jennifer. What was it weighted? And as in high stakes or fairly low stakes?
Fairly low stakes. It was their first task, you know, first semester, first year. It was due in week 6. I think it was given 15%. But we also wanted to get through to them that, you know, the weekly readings were not optional.
yes.
You know, so, you know, that was my hidden agenda there, Priscilla, which was, you know, read them because you'll be tested on them. You know, and I never set an assessment task that I don't value, you know, and that's why probably I really do shy away from, you know, a class participation mark, because that's very objective, I think, you know. Because somebody might be participating well in class and I'm just not hearing them, you know, or seeing them.
And I think we had that last dot point there because, as we were saying before, that professional standards do make it easy to collect specific types of evidence.
It gives them direction, and you know, there's a sentence there, you know, knows their students and can, I don't know what the standards is, this is showing me up, isn't it? Knows their students and how to teach them or something like that, you know, and so they don't have to go, oh, well, I think I'll do this. They just go, okay, I've got to demonstrate how I know my students, you know, so I'm going to talk about individualised instruction or IEPs or something, individual education plans or something like that. You know, they're going to use language that actually meets that professional standard.
Good.
Thank you, Priscilla. I know I love a hidden agenda as well, and working in tertiary education means that we're constantly confronted by them.
Oh, well, I don't really love rubrics very much, but they've become the way that we can communicate more clearly with students about the feedback that we give them, and we can tell them exactly what we value in a piece of assessment. So those 6 criteria that we have on the bottom there, they're actually the 6 things that I judge any piece of assessment by. So it's not just about an ePortfolio, it could be an essay, a web page, a poster, whatever it is. To me, those 6 criteria are important for students to develop. So it needs to be presented well, even if it is a template. I mean, I say to students that Pebble just about does it for you, but you can still mess up the presentation. You can still have ugly colours and text not aligned and stuff. The work has to be structured well. They have to use a good style of communication, you know, the correct spelling and paragraphing. They need to show the development of their ideas. They need to show they've read and they've had, you know, good sources that are supporting their arguments, and the content has to be up to scratch. So they're the things that I use to assess an ePortfolio of any kind. I mean, the content could be any real topic, and that gets as much weighting as some of the other things.
I think it's important, though, that if you're going to give feedback, you want it 100% to be read or
Absolutely.
heard or seen. You know, so I always KISS, you know, keep it simple, stupid. I make it accessible. So luckily on Pebble, we actually have a comment icon, bubble.
Yes.
You know, and so I can put that into their portfolio. I can actually comment. I can, you know, I don't just say, nice job, I really enjoyed reading this. I can say, interestingly, you know, found a roadblock in the particular piece of music you were teaching. How might you think about your repertoire choice next time for a Year 9 boys' school? You know, so I'm really specific to what it do. And I quite often in my feedback will ask a question. And it's not that they then rush up to me after a lecture and go, thanks for that question, I've got the answer to you. But if I'm posing a question, then I'm hoping that they're exploring an answer.
Are you going to be able to answer that, Shane? Thomas asks, is there a comment bubble on Mahara?
There's, in 1504, there's a dialogue. So in 15.04, there's a dialogue tool that students can add to a page that you can have a dialogue on. But there's no comment bubble that you can attach to an artifact on a page and talk about things. With the Smart Evidence project, there's that would provide the dialogue attached to a particular piece of evidence that someone puts in against a competency. That's just something that we're working on with Catalyst and anyone else who's interested. But at the moment, the best thing you can do is add a dialogue to the page near where you want to have the conversation and use other feedback on the page. But I'm wondering whether that's the best option anyway, because as we go into the future and people are using YouTube videos and Prezi presentations and Sketchfab 3D models that they're embedding on their pages, how do you capture all of that in your feedback anyway, and how do you capture that for requirements around storing the assessment item for 3 or 4 years or whatever after the submission.
Mm.
And it becomes impossible on any of the current platforms to do that, because PebblePad or Mahara or anything is not going to capture that YouTube video and store it. It's not going to take the Prezi presentation. You wouldn't be able to play it back anyway. Students can delete that content because it's outside of the bounded system that you provided. So it becomes very messy until you start to perhaps think about how you capture that experience in a single artifact, which at the end of the day can only be, I think, a screencast or a recording. So as you're actually reviewing and marking the portfolio, you're screen recording that experience. I think that's the only way to do it.
Okay.
And then you provide that recording both as feedback to the student, but also it becomes your record that will last a few years. And it doesn't matter what the student does with their content after that.
My comment when we discussed this was that you will then end up with a lot of very big files.
You will, so you need a way to manage that.
Yeah, and so at the moment UC does not provide us with enough file space on our, sort of UC logins.
Yeah, it's something that
remotely
we'll
do
have
that.
to tackle in the re-procurement process or the procurement process. It might be that you use something like the Echo lecture recording system and only give the link to the student for that feedback, which is what Peter Donnan used to do here a few years ago. He used to do that just for Word documents. He would just record that whole process, talking to the student as he went through marking it. I mean, it's
Very personal.
very cutting edge sort of guy, but he's retired. But you could, I think that's what you would do with portfolio, and we might need to invest in a system that allows you to store these hard files and to provide that, the link and the feedback.
Could I ask though that is a very time-consuming way of giving feedback to a student, in that if they've got something which has, say maybe half a dozen lines, 20 lines of text, they can read that quickly and assimilate that. If they've got to wait while you're thinking through and making the occasional remark, it might, theoretically, it only takes you 15 minutes to mark an assignment, but in practice, it often takes longer. So if they've got to wade through sort of half an hour's marking time, that's
There's
quite a lot.
pros and cons, I think. One of the good things about recording feedback to students is they hear your voice. So we hear that they do really appreciate having that personal touch. And I know one of my colleagues does that a lot, but the main reason he started to do that was because he couldn't type. So that was a way for him to more quickly give good feedback to students than trying to do two-finger typing.
I'm conscious of the time at 5 to 4, so I thought we might just move on into our final one, which is, oh, I'm going the wrong way. No, I'm going the right way. What's happening? I can't go backwards. Yes, I can. Which is really the learning and teaching design. I put my little 2 cents worth in there, which was map it carefully, be really clear about your learning outcomes, and make sure that the task is aligned. Assess what you really want to assess, and take all the fluff out. And I think that will also make the portfolio process and product very meaningful to the student.
And Lynn is supporting your comments, Jennifer, by saying the curation skills can be the creative aspects in compiling collections of work.
Yeah. I think it's also this curatorial skills that is what I would consider to be a really valuable graduate attribute, graduate capability, and yet we don't, I suppose, force that terribly much.
Name it.
Or name it.
Yeah.
And I think the portfolio process and the product really does force it and name it. And I think that, when I say to my students, you've got to classify it, they go, oh, biology, classification of plants. I go, no, you've got to classify it. Where do you see this? What standard does it match? How important is it? What's the value? What learning outcome did it meet? And I need them to be able to articulate as they're curating, so that they really understand and know what they're about. This makes a better communicator in our graduates as well.
We do have to teach them how to do that, though. We do have to help them explain and use the language by asking them the questions, good key questions to respond to.
Yeah, we're the facilitator of this process. We've got to take ownership of it. And as I said before, if we model it well and explicitly say, hey, what I'm doing right now is modeling a good pedagogic practice, think about it, use it, you know, get on board, then I think they're much better. I think it's important for them to enjoy also achieving the assessment task. And I'm not saying that we all of a sudden grade inflate and everyone gets HDs. What I'm saying is that they actually understand the task before they start it, and they enjoy showing that they've met, you know, the particular requirements that are there. I've got a couple of digital stories there that are links, and I'm going to let you have a look at that later. I also included one of my webfolio pages from one of my students that was talking very specifically about leadership. So one of the professional standards was demonstrating leadership for accreditation, and so she really wrote about it, but she talked very specifically. So it's a nice example or exemplar, if we want to say, about you know, her demonstrating leadership. I suppose very clearly for us in Pebble, the evidence is an asset or an artefact, and so we talk and we use those words consistently through the 4 years of the degree. I don't want to see the ePortfolio only as a storage area, but it might not be a bad way to sort of start in that showcase way. I see it much more as a personal learning space where the students talk about how they've learned and what they've learned, and learn to articulate that in a really clear way. I've got a blank slide of the digital story from UC there, so we'll get Shane to talk about that later. But we've got a really nice metaphor here from Charles Sturt.
A very fresh one. So the student, who is not very far from being a teacher, a fresh early career teacher, used this, will be using this in their final part of their ePortfolio, and it's, we asked them to have an image that's a metaphor for themselves as coming through the degree. We asked them in the first year that they come in, and then we asked them again in the 4th year. And so this is a 4th year student who actually lay down on the road and either had the camera take the photograph or had someone take the photograph of her. And when we opened it, was sort of like, ah! But she's explaining, and I don't know if you can see this, she's looking backwards towards us. And she says, that's where I've come from. That's the 3.5 years of my degree. I'm looking at it behind me. And the road ahead, you know, there's a little turn in it, and it could take me anywhere, but I'm really excited and keen and interested in where I might go as a new teacher. And she's had some pretty interesting experiences in her 4 years, different prac experiences. So it gave her a chance. She talked out loud about this metaphor, but she'll then put that in as a little narrative or story to explain her feelings about where she sees herself as a pre-service teacher now. And then I just included an example front page from one of our portfolios. So you can see this, if you know Pebble at all, as Jennifer's was, it's the classic, which is on its way out. But even here you can see that the student has quite a bit of responsibility. You know, Pebble provides templates, but she's been able to put different things in that mean personal things to her, so she's made it quite different to anybody else's. And I think that that's what we try to say to them when they get to the end. You know, you could be putting things that have meaning for you in to make your points about yourself, to build a good argument why you are a good teacher, a good prospective teacher. And the navigation down the left side, as you would see in Jennifer's example, are all the other pages that they've got information about. And you can see the sorts of things that we ask. This is a master's degree student, but these are the sorts of things that we ask them to reflect on or report on over the entire time of their degrees. They're sort of pulling all the threads together in this final ePortfolio.
But how lovely, she's used a Wordle
Yes.
with all of the words that she sees as being relevant to becoming a teacher. And she's got diversity as
Big
her
one.
centre one there. Well, it's now 4:02 and I think we're officially an hour into there. We might just finish by saying the choice of evidence is really about ensuring that they meet the learning outcomes. I think it's important also that you set personal learning targets for each student and encourage them to always be aware that they've got learning targets of their own that are beyond the assessment task. So that's where accreditation really comes into it. I think giving them an opportunity to share with their peers. We've run 2 student showcases and the students who are giving the actual explanation and classification and curation of their portfolios say that they got more out of the opportunity to explain it than they did out of actually creating it, because they had to articulate and really think about what they'd learnt there. I know that you know, they will gain a deeper, more rounded insights into learning, enabling them to, you know, be better facilitators of learning by going through this process. The jigsaw puzzle that's there is very hard and small to see, but like anything, I've posed you lots of questions, and they're under, this is inside our project website, ePortfolioassist.com.au, but it's actually asking you questions about how you can create better portfolios through the pedagogy, the philosophy, your curriculum, your commitment, resourcing and support and tools for learning. So have a discussion. We're going to have one here at UC with our face-to-face, real-life people, humans, just quickly about, you know, professional development in alternate pedagogical approaches help me to implement the portfolio in my teaching, and will the introduction of ePortfolio actually require a program redesign of some kind. But have a discussion with your own institution about that. I'd like to say a very big thank you to UC for hosting Jenny and I, and for Shane. And thank you very much for everybody. It's really lovely to have you participating. And our next webinar is going to be on the 14th of September. And we'll be out in Wagga
We will.
at Charles Sturt.
Wagga Wagga.
Yeah. So thank you.